Welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And today we are digging into linguistics for the very first time. Shiloh spends a lot of his time in the evenings researching ancient dead languages. I have a lot of thoughts about communication of animals and their capacity to express complex ideas.
In other words, we're super nerds.
And we finally found somebody to talk to us about this. So we have Gašper Beguš with us, who's a professor of linguistics at UC Berkeley and also works on this really cool project where they're trying to figure out how to use AI and machine learning to communicate with sperm whales. And we figured that he would be kind of the ideal person to... You're looking very concerned at me right now. You're literally looking at me like...
No, I just was wondering if when I said we're super nerds, whether it made it sound like I was saying we are super nerds or whether we're super nerds, like we're really nerdy, or whether we're really good nerds. The word super and supreme has led me down some terrible paths today, so I'm just trying to make sure I'm communicating properly.
At some point in this conversation, Shiloh asks Gašper if Proto-Indo-European was the language that took over because of its supremacy, and Gašper almost blew a fuse. Linguistic supremacy is not on the table, but we are super nerds.
Not super nerds.
Not superior nerds, just very nerdy people. We like to have these conversations where we dig into a new subject with somebody who has a really broad perspective. And in this conversation, we cover human language, we cover AI and machine learning, and we cover animal communication. And we don't get like terribly deep into the details or the weeds, but we do get this overview of like, what does the field look like right now? How are people thinking about language? You still look really concerned.
Well, there's a lot of arguments about these things. Like, Are there differences between these three modalities, and what are they? And the history of debate between animal and human language is in some ways mirroring the history of debate between AI and human thought. Also, the separation of thought and language, is that even possible? That's a huge part of the discussion as well.
You're not going to ask me why I'm looking at you like that?
Well, you're obviously making fun of me.
It's a great conversation. We have a really good time with Gašper. If you want to know more about his work, he works on the SETI project, which is the CETI, and he's also the principal investigator of the Berkeley Speech and Computation Lab. So you can check out his work there. If you like what we do, we would really, really, really appreciate it if you would support us, because we want to operate on the basis of a patron model as opposed to hawking tchotchkes and various other extraneous goods that we can hawk you on the internet. And so you can come over to patreon.com/demystifysci. You can give us a couple dollars a month. In return, you get discounts to our conferences. You get to meet with us once a week at our super awesome patron chat. Not supremacy patron chat, just great place to hang out. And did I already say you get both episodes early?
You did. The cool part about the patron chat too is we can talk about anything we want, and can't really do that at YouTube. So it's a special place where we have a really protected, cool area where we can chop it up.
You're making this sound like it's a supremacy chat as opposed to just a super chat.
No, I'm just saying, it's a completely free marketplace of ideas, and that's really beautiful. And it would be difficult to do in a public space necessarily. Not public, but one that's owned by somebody, which obviously YouTube is. So I really love it for that reason too. If you don't have the money to become a patron right now, there's lots of ways you can support the podcast, right? You could just tell somebody about it. That's probably the best thing you can do. Growing that net of people that we're reaching really appeals to new guests when we reach out to them. People want to see those numbers. So if you haven't hit that subscribe button, please do it. It will actually help this podcast become more powerful. Tell us what you think. Tell us what we suck at. Tell us what ideas you're fascinated by, you'd like to see more of. So get in the comment section, come over to Facebook, come over to Discord, Twitter, every single social media platform. We are listening. And if you really want to go deep, I would highly recommend that you start paying attention to the event that we're putting on this summer, which is absolutely historic. There is something very, very interesting happening in the field of cosmology right now. The entire field is teetering on the edge of an absolute scientific revolution, a paradigm shift like we haven't seen in 100 years in those sciences. And we're bringing together people on all sides of that argument this summer in Sesimbra, Portugal, for a weekend of panel discussions, talks, and you're welcome to sign up and present a poster as well and get your own discussion going. So check out the link up here to find out more about that event and the whole Demysticon project.
If you're looking for something closer to home and you don't want to go all the way to Portugal, another way that you can join us is for our very first segment of Paradigm Drift. It is occurring on February 20th at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time. It is a Thursday. And we're going to get together with one of our esteemed friends who's a civil engineer who's going to help us evaluate random theories from people on the internet. Contestants have 1 minute, 60 seconds, no more, to present their theory, at which point Shiloh, myself, and Doug will sit down and we will interview them about it. We'll ask you questions about how it is that you put it together, why you think that it's so important, and anything else that we can think of at the time. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
With the goal, really, of helping people consolidate their theories into statements that can really attract more work on those ideas. Because a huge problem that we've noticed over the years is people have brilliant ideas, but they're really crappy at selling them or presenting them or putting them in a succinct term that can get it from your head into somebody else's, which is half the battle in science. So hopefully we'll learn a ton about how to do that ourselves by watching people kill and watching people just absolutely bomb at it. And I think it's going to be really constructive and awesome. I'm absolutely stoked for this pilot project.
And the link to sign up for that is right here. Also, everything that we've mentioned is in the description. And for now, enjoy the conversation about the history of linguistics, animal communication, and machine learning with Gašper Beguš.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystified Podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
As we were setting up the studio, we got into kind of a heated discussion about LLMs and language and human cognition, where it's like, we have a weekly patron chat, and the last patron chat was actually kind of all about this, where there's a camp of people who are like, hey, the way that humans treat words has to do with the abstract relationship of the words to concepts. Mm-hmm. And the way that LLMs treat words is fundamentally different. They're just in this, this embedding space. And so machine cognition and human cognition look nothing alike. They will never cross. And I'm not sure if that's the case or not. So I wonder if to start with, did I represent that accurately, do you think?
I'll take it. Yeah. I'm in that camp, but Nastia's in the other camp.
Yeah, I can be in Nastia's camp.
All right, this will be fun.
So yeah, maybe you can tell us about where this comes from, because my suspicion, to ask a leading question, is that when we as adults think about our relationship to words and concepts and how we learn things, it's like talking to somebody. We've already figured it out. Like, we've crossed the 0 to 1 threshold of being able to make the mappings, and we don't actually remember what it looks like to go from 0 mappings of words to concepts. And so I think that there's something that's happening inside of babies, maybe, that's more like machine learning than is not like machine learning.
Yeah, there's like camps around this, right? So one kind of mind-blowing thing that happened when LLMs became a thing is that you can actually learn language just by, being exposed to language, right? That was like a long-standing debate in linguistics, again, with camps. So can you learn language just by being exposed to it? Or is there something in our brain that predisposes to language and kind of biases us toward learning language in the way we learn it, right? So, the Chomsky is one big figure of this second worldview, right? So we have complex things in language, right? When you ask a question, what did you eat tonight, right? That what starts the sentence, right? The WH word, the what word starts the sentence. But if you say I ate a banana tonight, banana is, after the verb, comes after the verb, right? So there's like rules of how we do things in language that linguists said, well, they're not obvious. It's not obvious why we do this. There are rules about how we put sounds together, right? So you cannot say in English or in many other languages, you cannot say a word with PTK at the beginning, right? PTK is in English not good. So there's all sorts of rules, and they're very similar across languages. So, the generative grammar, the Chomskyan approach to linguistics will say, well, first of all, these rules have to come from somewhere, and babies are very fast at learning them, right? The babies are amazing. Within a year, they master this language that no other animals have. And so they came up with this idea that our brain is predisposed for language, right? So Pinker calls it language instinct, right? So our brain come pre-born to basically do language. And that's why you have all these rules across languages. That's why kids are so fast at learning them. And so the idea was that based on just looking at language, there's no way a human could master all these rules and dependencies without that capacity, innate, pre-available, pre-born capacity. And that was because partially, computation was not there yet, right? I remember I took classes at MIT when I was in grad school, and people were trying to do exactly what LLMs have been doing, but with different approaches, right? So there's Bayesian statistics approaches, and they wanted to build a system that will do a language by just predicting the next word. And that was the other maybe camp, right? The non-Chomsky's camp. So they were trying to do that, but they failed because the computational approach was not powerful enough, right? So the camp that says, or the approach that says, you cannot learn language just by being exposed to it, had good argument because no computer program could do it, and they said no animals can do it. Although there was at the time already some animal research on bonobos and other species. And then, we really live in exciting times because what people set out to do a long time ago actually happened a couple of years ago, right? So they built a neural network model that predicts next word, and just by doing that, basically learns language, learns all the difficult rules, actually learns it really well by just looking at text, right? By just being exposed to a massive amount of text. And that really, poses a problem for the approach that you cannot do language without being some sort of predisposed, have some sort of predisposition for it. Now, there's very few human things about neural nets, especially these, latest ones that are called transformers, right? So they are artificial approximation of how our neurons work. There's nothing language specific about them. They don't come pre-born. You don't set up your LLM, large language models like GPT, to do, to care about where the what word will come. It learns that by just training, and it learns language so well. So this is, in a sense, a revolution. The cards are mixed now, and in science and in linguistics. And it's always great to be in science when something like this happens, because it really questions some of the deeply rooted assumptions that we had about language. So that's one part. That's just one, the one part how LLMs kind of, mix the cards. And now we have to figure out what a real model of language will be.
All right, so I'm hearing you outline these two camps as like this predisposition that humans perhaps have that's special versus just exposure to language. That I totally understand that. I was more arguing with Nastya about thought versus language. So whether the computers, what they're doing, whether it's similar in the way that they construct their grammar and syntax to humans, like I can see that argument. You learn how to talk, and then you go to grade school and somebody tells you what all the parts of speech are, and you learn the names for the rules, but you already kind of understood that just empirically. It's like you can learn how to play a sport, and then someone comes along and tells you how legs work, with action potentials and so forth, and you're like, okay, I guess I could see that. But the thing that I think we were debating in the patron chat was really whether language for a human is a representative of abstractions that are extant prior to the expression, whereas it seems like computers are working in the other way around, where they're looking at associations linguistically and then throwing back that association network in a prioritized manner that lends itself to looking like it's a conceptualization, but it isn't actually a conceptualization. It just happens to taste like it is. So I don't know if you've thought at all about that dichotomy, thought versus language, like which comes first? Because I think I could see a camp where somebody says, hey, you can't really have thoughts without language. And I'm not sure that that's true, but I could see that argument too.
Well, that's a very interesting. Actually, it's an ongoing debate right now. Also, because large language models, shook the ground a little bit. Okay, so the question about language and thought is a really deep one, and there are two possibilities, right? Either language and thought are the same thing, or intertwined or kind of inseparable, and Wittgenstein and Chomsky and so on will probably, people with those worldviews will probably think that, you can't do thought, you can't do complex thought without language, right? And that's why, if you extend this to animals, then only humans have complex thought, because only humans have this kind of language that we, praise and are fascinated by. I'm not saying that I subscribe to that. The other actually possibility is that there is thought, there is complex abstract thought that you just mentioned, and language is just a channel to transmit that thought into another individual, right? So in my brain, I make computations. I think I have concepts. They're like multidimensional. How if you think of knowledge, right? It usually is represented as a graph. Like when you listen to a lecture, one good way to represent what person is saying is with a graph, like with knowledge graph. But that person is conveying that to me or to you, and I'm conveying my thoughts now through language, which is this simple linearization algorithm that allows me to transmit what I think into what you think. So that has really broad implications for animals then, right? So there are a couple of possibilities there. Can animals, do they have complex thought with concepts that are meaningful to them, right? And then maybe they have different channel of transmitting those thoughts, right, to other individuals. Or is the fact that they don't have the same language as we have, telling of that, there is lack of complex thought or something like that. And there's other interesting things that this opens, but like LLMs, the neuroscientists and people in the computation side are now presenting evidence that language is just a channel in a way. And internally, I've been going back and forth about this quite a bit. You brought up something also kind of tangentially related, which is this ability to think about language. That is another interesting thing. I'm working on that specifically because LLMs are not only good at producing language. It's not just what you see. They just trick us all into thinking, oh, their text is like, really, it looks real. We did this experiment to show that the latest models are actually able to even think about language itself. So to do this metacognitive, metalinguistic reasoning or performance. So that is another interesting thing about language, because if you look at animals and humans, there's very little that, if you look at their communication system and our communication system, they have many aspects of our communication system, of our language, right? Not every single one, and not in the exact same shape or form, but they can do symbolic reasoning. Animals can do, they can talk about objects that are not present in the room. They can do all sorts of things. There are a few things that they cannot do. The recursive reasoning and this recursion that is ubiquitous in language, and they cannot, at least as far as we can say, they cannot reason about their language themselves. So those are all, really, people are now looking into those questions, like what is thought, what is language? Are they intertwined, or is language just a linearization algorithm that allows me to channel my internal state into your internal state? And then what I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, and what LLMs tell you is, what are all the things that can emerge without human predispositions, right? Without human biases. And then, crucially, that doesn't mean that humans do things exactly the same as LLMs. And it doesn't mean that we don't have a predisposition, but it puts a burden of evidence on the side of the debate that says there is something pre-available, pre-born, language is innate. So, I think it's an ongoing research. There's really exciting evidence from neuroscience that language is actually just a channel. I mean, that has, profound consequences for the animal world. It doesn't mean that animals lack complex thought. And just one thing that I'll mention maybe right now, which is to me so fascinating. And when I was a grad student, I worked with Irene Pepperberg, and she had famously Alex the parrot, right? The amazing, the most brilliant parrot, African gray parrot. And African gray parrots are so amazing because they're able to master human phonetics, human sounds of human language to amazing degrees, right? So they can basically mimic our speech, perfectly. And through that, Irene Pepperberg was like training this Alex, and Alex's intelligence only became apparent to us when he was able to transmit it through language. Okay? He was able to learn our language that is completely foreign to him and show us that he can count, that he can distinguish black and green and blue and red objects, and he can actually do this compositionally. He could distinguish, blue squares from red spheres or stuff like that. And basically, he mastered that channel that allowed us to see just how intelligent he was. And in a sense, I say this a lot. If you think of it, we haven't done that yet, right? Humans have not learned a foreign animal communication so that we could make that channel. It was animals, in a sense, who did it first. And so that, again, is language is just a channel to our inner states, to our inner thoughts, to our complex thoughts, or, is thought impossible without language?
We try all the time. We were actually just going for a walk in our neighborhood. We live out in the country, and there's some cows that live nearby. and we were trying very hard to learn their language and communicate with them yesterday on our walk.
It's working. You can talk to a cow and the cow will talk back, it turns out. But God, there's so much in there. Before we get too far away from it, can you lay on the table a brief definition of recursion for people?
Yeah. Yes, of course. So the reason why I'm interested in recursion, and many people are, is because, the longer people looked at other communication systems, and now we're also looking at LLMs, to be honest, right? What can they do and what they can't? Is the longer they looked into this, the more they realize, there are just a few things about our language that are absent in other species or in machines. And one of them was recursion. Recursion is this ability of language to embed one element in language into another element of the same type, right? And I'll give you an example. Anastasia said that the flower is green, and Gašper said that Anastasia said that flower is green. And you can always make this larger and larger and larger, right? So you can basically infinitely embed one sentence into another sentence, into another sentence, into another sentence. And recursion is, in a sense, an infinity of language, right? If you think of mathematical infinity, recursion is this ability to do this. And
it seems like it also parallels thought too, which seems special for humans. We have this, in the world of thought, we would probably just call it an abstraction or a conceptualization, but you have really primary, simple abstractions. Like, I think the most simple abstraction would be a location, for instance, because it's just the distances to the other objects in the scene. And so, we see, obviously, animals have that primary abstraction available, but when it comes to the way that they organize beyond, I was thinking of bees, for instance, right? They're able to say where the nectar is at and tell people back at the hive, tell the other bees, the bee people. And that seems like a really primary, the most primary abstraction, which represents some abstract thought, this thing is over there. But then in terms of being able to nest that with other concepts, like this thing is over there and it tastes okay. It kind of tastes like a clover. What do you guys think about clovers? We have no idea whether they're doing that or not, essentially.
Right. Well, actually, with bees is interesting because it was thought that comes, again, pre-available, right? So bees are born with the ability to dance, to express where the food is, just like dogs are, born with the ability to bark. But now they're realizing that actually there's a aspect of learning as well, right? Because the more you dance, the more you're exposed to the dance, the better you are at it. And that is what human language is as well, right? So and if you look at birds, some bird song are actually learned by the father. It's usually in the function of mating, but bird song are they learned vocalizations, and language is learned vocalization, right? So this aspect of it being learned is super important because humans cannot do language without being exposed to it, right? You need primary linguistic data, so-called. Now the question is how much data you need, and some people think that humans are so amazing because there's very little data that you need to learn language. But the aspect of being a learned vocalization is very important. And one of the things that I'm interested in, we talk about LLMs. So LLMs were groundbreaking to show us what are the limits of some artificial intelligence, right? What can AI, what can some mathematical approximation of human brain trained on rocks or sand, in the chips, what can emerge in those situations, right? So then you can say, well, those things are not uniquely humans. Those things are not special to us. What I think we need to do now as well is to build more realistic models of human language, right? So to see, as we learn this vocalization, can they be similar as well, right? So can the stages of a child learns language, and it learns it in stages, right? So we all started babbling, and then we started saying one word, and it was probably a noun. Probably your parents told you what your first word was. 9 times out of 10, it was probably some noun. For me, it was tractor, for example. Anyway, there are stages that humans undergo, right? And so what I'm interested in is like building models that have to learn not from massive amounts of text, but from spoken language, right? Just listening to sounds, trying to imitate and mimic language, just like humans have to imitate and mimic, right? And imagine to speak. To see, can our machines also similar to our development, to our learning, to our acquiring language from sound, or is this something just very different, and they just trick us into the hype is just tricking us into thinking that those are similar.
Well, it's really interesting because at the foundation of this, there seems to be a philosophical question, which is that if you look at the animal world, and I include humans in the animal world, you have this embodied cognition where you go around and you touch things and you look at things and you feel things, and then you have thoughts, and then from that, someone who has already figured out this magical thing of being able to communicate teaches you how to communicate, and so now you're able to siphon everything that's happening into your head into the external world, and now you are fully linked into the rest of the infosphere. And so it's this it's a very clear progression from experience to thought to speech, which it's interesting to hear you say that there's like camps about
Well,
this.
people don't always agree that thought precedes language is, I guess, the biggest
I think they're
division.
probably wrong. I know nothing about this, but I'm like, that seems crazy to me, right? Because like,
Yeah, it'd be cool to steelman those people. Like, why in the world do they think that?
like what's happening inside of animal brains? It's just like some kind of like pattern that's firing that they think is causing behavior without like any processing of thought.
Well, so
Have they ever met like a cat or a dog?
you mentioned that there's a sequence of things. First, you do X. You learn language even before you're born. Way before you're born. You're in gestation. Actually, it's been shown over and over again. If you read the same story to a during gestation, the newborn will react differently to that story. Even words. If you read few words differently, a few words over and over again to during gestation, the newborn, like right after they're born, will be able to respond differently. German babies cry different. Babies of German parents cry differently because than the babies of French parents, because the stress system of German is different from French, right? So actually,
What's a stress system?
well, in French, obviously, you have you stress this last syllable, right? And in German, you just stress the first syllable. So babies will cry "where" in French, but where in German.
That's amazing.
So it's been documented that it's actually really interesting because that's. So I'm building the thing is that if you build models with AI, you have a lot of questions to ask about language that you wouldn't necessarily ask yourself. So I was like, what comes first, right? And if you think of it, human babies during gestation are able to hear, I think, more complex sounds that are able to see. The complexity of sounds they hear and able to receive is, I think, higher than the complexity of the visual stimulus during gestation. So, I wouldn't say that first you see the world and then you move and sense, and only then you get language. I think language is, starts very early on.
So the caveat that I have to introduce there is that I did my PhD on bacterial biofilms, right? And so the most fundamental aspect that I was studying was oxidative stress. And there's no way for me to conceptualize oxidative stress and the systems that are in place inside the bacteria as being a sensation of the environment and then a reaction to it.
By the way, for normal people, that's like breathing bacteria, essentially. Oxidative stress is how they sense whether they can breathe or not.
Basically, yeah, like, am I suffocating? And so I'm like, you talk to people that are, thank you for that. Nerdlandia appeared for a moment. So you talk to people that are studying consciousness and they're like, man, it's amazing. Like, where does human consciousness come from? And the newborn gradually boots consciousness. And I'm like, I think that there's a continuum there where during gestation, the fetus is experiencing. There's no problem with that because you're booting the systems gradually where you're starting to experience. And so you don't have to be born in order to like look out onto the world. I think that the research is clear that there's there's a sensorium that builds and you get past a certain point of gestation and the sensorium is there. And so it makes perfect sense that things are already getting patterned onto it. So I'm not
like the most primary experience imaginable might be comfort or discomfort, something like that, or pain or no pain.
Yeah, exactly. And then like
hungry, not hungry.
I imagine, again, like I don't know a ton about this, but I imagine that like as you get closer and closer to birth, the sensorium is progressively more and more complex. And so it seems arbitrary that you would expect that only past the moment of actually leaving the womb do you begin to accumulate this stuff. I'm like, there's not like a magical switch that flips.
And I think what you're saying really kind of leads to something that is super interesting and part of the debates in science right now as well, which is, we've built these models of human language, right? And it turns out that a lot of our knowledge can be represented with them, right? So the biggest models are now, they are really good at many things, right? And so, you mentioned, is human intelligence or is our humanity intrinsically connected to the way we are able to interact with the environment and sense things, right? And, these models that we build, this mathematical approximation of our brain will never be able to even closely get to what we are, right? There's never going to be consciousness because they're not embodied. There's never going to be, curiosity because maybe there's no, there's no evolution. But I think that there is a problem with that argument, and I'm going to try to build the story. So, the brain, and it has to do with what you said. You cannot feel like a bacteria can, right? But these models might be able to. So if you think of a brain of a fruit fly, right? We were able to map for the first time, scientists, not our lab, but scientists were able to really carefully map each neuron in a fruit fly's brain. It's 140,000 neurons altogether, okay? And we have a lot of neurons. We have 80 billion neurons. And the brain of the fruit fly is quite different from ours, obviously, but in principle, it's neurons, right? And there are connections between them. So if you increase, the power of a fruit fly to us, everything happened there, right? We got language, we got complex thought. I mean, maybe fruit flies have complex thought, I don't know, but probably, maybe not. We got language, complex thought, consciousness, all the things. Self, you can recognize yourself in the mirror, right? We passed the mirror test, and so do some other animals. So, if you increase the power of our brain, you get all these things that we value about humans. Now, I don't see a real reason why, as you increase the power of these models, stuff like that would be impossible. I'm open to arguments, but I do not see a very compelling argument that tells me that as you grow the capacity of the largest model, and by the way, the largest models are still smaller than our brain. And, the idea is that you cannot grow our brain infinitely, but you can grow these models, higher and higher. And crucially, currently, they only look at language. Most of them just look at language, okay? This is insane that they are able to be so good by just looking at words. Now, we will be able to add all sensors that humans don't have, right? I can feel, I can smell, I can see and hear and so on. I have some senses. And they'll be able to, the models that we're going to be building will be able to have all of that and a million other sensors, right? They'll be able to feel the Earth. They'll be able, through all the satellites and sensors, right? As if like somebody as smart as a human would have like not 6 senses but 1,000 of them. They'll be trained on data that humans don't even are able to comprehend. And so I have yet to hear a really compelling argument which says that this kind of emergence, if language was able to emerge, does that mean that the complex thought is already there, or is in the models, or is it still coming? But like consciousness emerged in the evolution from fruit fly brain to us. So all these things emerge, and so I don't think there's
if I may, it seems like that fundamental assumption is where the test lies. Like if the fruit fly actually is conscious and has complex we have to define the word complex. I'd like to do that too, but if it has the ability to abstract regardless of its communication abilities, I don't know anything about fruit flies communication, but I'm sure somebody knows something about it. But if they do have that ability innately, like if life forms have the ability innately to abstract and computers actually have to mimic it and work up to a very convincing version of it, they might still arrive at the same destination but converge on it from different approaches. So it seems like to answer that question, you really do need to know, is the fruit fly thinking or not?
The fruit fly has to be thinking.
I agree.
I cannot imagine, like, it's just inconceivable. Like, when people say that consciousness emerges on the way to humans, I'm like, self-awareness emerges on the way to humans. The ability to, like, do recursion emerges on the way to humans.
Infinite
I'll buy
recursion.
all of those things. Consciousness, though, I will die on the hill of the fact that the bacterium is conscious. Like, that's, and so
It's just an emotional argument.
I'm not actually okay. So bumblebees have been shown. Have you seen that experiment where bumblebee? If you narrow the path of a bumblebee, it'll try to fly through it, but its wings are too wide. So what it'll do is like the bumblebee will kind of go in the perpendicular to the opening. So to some people, they suggest that it's some sort of, self-awareness where you know how big you are, and then, but it could also be some sort of prenate or learned behavior.
I think we have an inherent need to be able to differentiate humans from everybody else. Like, I literally think that there's like a theological principle upon which we stand, which is like, so here are the humans and here is everybody else, and nobody else has this like magical thing that we have, and how did we spring from the forehead of Zeus fully formed? And I'm like,
made in the image of God.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, you simplify things if you're like, well, yeah, obviously the bumblebee needs to know how big it is, because if it doesn't, it'll die. Like, that has to be the most foundational principle that's inherent in all animals.
Right.
And I'm like, animals fail the mirror test. I'm like, well, what if they think what if they just have no interest in themselves? Right? Like, like, granted, like, I think that zebrafish fail the mirror test in the way that they will just continuously, ceaselessly attack themselves in the mirror. And so I'm like, maybe they're just stupidly aggressive. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's many different ways that you could interpret this. that isn't a complete lack of consciousness
or a lack of self.
Okay.
But hold on. I want to bring this to the point where it's like, I think that what Shiloh said earlier is really interesting, which is that I think that it's, even if you like remove the nuance of like what is consciousness and what isn't consciousness, the question that we have in front of us is, can you arrive at the same destination from two different directions? Because all of biology appears to have arrived at consciousness through this evolutionary path of embodiment, where you gradually build more and more complex systems that require, for whatever specialized function your species has, a certain level of that awareness, where it's like the bee doesn't need to write the Iliad,
Right.
but for whatever reason, humans do.
Right.
Like that's just like, that's our cultural product.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so we have arrived on this one tree, and so we're standing here and we're like, wow, we're capable of all of these incredible things. And the question now is, okay, well, if you take a system that doesn't have any of that evolutionary awareness, and yet you embody it and you train it and you give it access to all of these like networks and sensoriums, is it suddenly able to fully emulate the thing that we prize so much, having arrived from a different direction? Like, that's the question.
Right. And by the way, the stuff that we prize so much, like recursion and metalinguistics, we show that LLMs can do that. So that has been achieved by them in a sense, right? So what maybe you're saying is that, it's kind of a Moravec's paradox again, right? So chess and recursion and all these things that we think are so special about humans, they're not yet there. They're already there in the AI, in the LLMs, right? In large language models. But the things that we don't praise as much, maybe this kind of the consciousness in your sense, where a bumblebee needs to know how big it is, that will never, or like that is much more difficult in an artificial model and might not ever arise because there's no embodiment or because there's no evolution. Is that
What about, like, you mentioned curiosity? You seem to so curiosity and goal orient, like the production of new goals. There's something generative and creative that seems special to me at the moment about humans. I mean, if you're right, and this network of LLMs boots up this Gaian self-consciousness and everything, like maybe, but at what point does it start to evolve curiosity?
Yes, yeah. Well, that's excellent. We were just driving. I was driving to San Francisco with a bunch of one philosopher, one mathematician, and my spouse, and we were.
Sounds like the start of a joke. Yeah,
yeah, that's right. No, it was true. We were going to ride the Benjamin Bradenstock, who was here just a couple of days ago. Anyway, so we were talking about this, and as the models are becoming so good at language and metacognition and all sorts of tasks that we value so hard, it was like I said to the philosopher and mathematician, I said, well, I think curiosity is one thing that will not develop as fast as we think, and I think they'll be, the models are going to be performing super well on so many tasks. I mean, they already are kind of. As a joke, I'm a historical linguist. I studied all dead languages and etymology, so what words mean and how to reconstruct the proto-language. It took me 5 years to figure out what my last name means, okay, or what it meant a long time ago. And just the other day, for joke, I was like, ask the latest model, the biggest model, try to say what my last name means, and of two of the guesses it had, one was probably correct. So I would have similar guesses. So they're becoming so good at many things, and I made this hypothesis that I think humans will, for the foreseeable future, when models become better at research and all sorts of things, will be the question askers. I think our curiosity is unique, and I think that's another thing that ties us to animals, at least the ones that we think are very intelligent. But I think curiosity is the one thing that will not arise, or the models will become smarter in many ways, in almost always smarter than us, before they develop their own curiosity. And I think curiosity, whatever that is very important. And in a sense, I think there's going to be a period where we are just asking the question, and the models can do answering. But to come up with a question is important, and halfway, you've done half of the work if you've asked the right question.
Very quick, if you want to come and make history with us, then come to Portugal this summer. We are hosting Beyond the Big Bang, the second conference that Demystify Sci has ever hosted. We have an excellent lineup of speakers, everybody from See the Pattern and Alexander Unziker and Eric Lerner, to C.S. Unikrishnan, to Mike McCullough, to Andre Koktoris Assis. It's going to be a fantastic weekend of talks, panels, poster presentations, where we all together are going to make history. Check it out here. And we'll see you in Portugal.
Curiosity seems very closely related to anxiety for me. Like, it seems like a very emotional, like, I think you have to start thinking about emotions when you start thinking about the generation of new thoughts. Because for me, I feel a very similar internal neurochemistry with anxiety and with curiosity, which is like I'm trying to figure something out, like something's not quite, and then by formulating a question, then we get into language. I formulate a question, I put my curiosity to a point, and I hand it out to the world, Google, my friends, whatever, someone I'm talking to like you. What do you imagine that there's a circuit of emotionality that needs to be programmed into these for that to appear, or will it just boot itself up?
Okay, my sense is that emotions are tied to biological world, right? And that's one thing that is gonna set us apart from machines for probably a long time. I don't see emotions or curiosity coming up soon, but what that means, I think, is I think we're gonna rethink our values system, and I think for the better, actually. So imagine, I am a scientist. I love discovering things, thinking about new things, right? I put value into myself if I find, if I think I found something interesting or new even, right? Like we scientists live for that 5 minutes of glory where you think you have something, right? And there might be a world where, these models become way better than us, not so far in the future, right? So Terence Tao, who's the famous mathematician at UCLA, said that the models are now roughly at the not so great but not bad mathematics PhD student of his, right? And that is mind blowing. Like and there's like a way where these models become better and better in mathematics and all these intelligences we value so much. That at a point you're gonna have to ask it, like, what is my value then, right? So if they're able to know the meaning of my last name better than I do, and I've studied this for decades. If they're starting to be better at proofs or solving complex mathematical questions, starting to solve complex physics questions, I think we're gonna realize, okay, this sand intelligence is better at these things that we valued so much. This intelligence or this human genius, that I think we're gonna start putting more value on biological intelligence per se, just because it is biological intelligence, right? And that will include emotions, right? So, and I see a lot of good things in that. And I think animal rights and animal protection and anything that will have biological, if you think of a world where sand intelligence is better than us in all mathematics and all the things we care and in all these complex questions, I think we will rethink and stop valuing that so much and start valuing, emotion, biological processing, opinions, arts, probably. I'm not too worried about arts. I don't think
orientation towards the future that we can
Yeah.
all agree is good for us, right?
Mhm.
There's something.
By the way, I need to interrupt you because you say, I get anxious and then I think and then I formulate the question. So you kind of said that language that thought is first and then you linearize it and channel it to me, right? When you say you formulate the question.
Oh yeah. Oh, I think that is definitely the case. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what's the steelman for it?
My argument at the beginning was just that I don't think that computers do that. Like, I don't see them doing this conceptualization at all, actually. And like, I'm open to the idea that they'll be able to do something that so closely resembles conceptualization. They'll get so good at making associations of already declared knowledge in the world that they will be effectively conceptualizing, but that they would do it in a different way than we do. Like they're not totally, you're right that they're really good at computation for the most part and some of these more technical PhD level topics, but I just had this ridiculous conversation with one of these AIs yesterday. I was just asking some very primary chemistry question, I was like, that pertained to how we note the presence of molecular hydrogen in these interstellar clouds through the surrogate presence of carbon monoxide. And I'm like, all right, well, and I'm talking to the chatbot about this, and it just keeps giving me this ridiculous chemical equation for the production of carbon monoxide that doesn't have any oxygen in it. And I'm like, you can't have a chemical equation for the production of an oxygen molecule without oxygen in the reactant side of the equation. And it just couldn't wrap its head around this for the life of it. And I thought, wow, that's very emblematic of the kind of characteristic stupidity of these things. And but I'm willing to entertain that they could get better and better at that. But I still don't know if it would pose that question to itself or really be prompting itself curiously ever.
And
Yeah.
we're able to show that they can analyze for the first time. That was amazing that they are able to analyze language itself, right? So, sentence. They're able to understand a sentence structure, right? So, a kid can say a sentence way before it can say what a noun and a verb is, right? Or how the WH word works. And the models were able to do that. They're, for the first time, they're able to analyze sentence as a linguist would, right? So meta-linguistics kind of emerged. And we were able to show that the best model really does that, pretty reliably. But it's not coming up with new proposals, right? Yet, right? So creativity in terms of, asking new questions is not there yet. I don't think that that's insurmountable, and it's possible that it'll happen, but it's not there yet. Okay, so.
But it also seems reasonable that it's not there yet because we're booting it's hard to call it an organism, but let's say organism. We're booting up this rock-based creature that has a different set of priorities than we do. And so it's like to say that, well, it doesn't seem to express curiosity about linguistics or about physics or about these other things. I'm like, it seems entirely plausible that in the same way that, okay, I don't have children, but I imagine from my experience, I've seen this happen where you have a child and that kid doesn't want to do the same thing that you want to do. Like their interests are totally divorced from yours. And maybe there's some fundamental patterns of reasoning, but the things that they're curious about don't reflect the fact that, you've been lawyers for like 6 generations and now the kid wants to be, I don't know, a rock star. And so it's like, okay, clearly there's some kind of break that can happen generationally. And so I wonder if there isn't something that we can learn from the rearing of children and the developing of children's minds that's applicable to the way that we're encountering these LLMs and
Well, I
everything
totally
else.
agree. I think that's why what we do in our lab is not LLMs. I mean, most of the time it's not LLMs. It's large language models or the transformer architecture is so popular now because it performs extremely well, right? It caught us all by surprise. But I totally agree. I think what I'm most excited about in this revolution, if you want to call it, is that we can build models that learn more like humans, right? So by and some of the things we talked about are baked in the models that we create is imitation from the environment, right? From stuff you hear from the parents, interaction between agents, right? So LLMs are just, one giant architecture that predicts the next word and it learns to chat, right? But if you think of babies, right, they interact with a bunch of people when they're born, right? And they need to create that communication. They desire the communication, right? They they're also embodied, right? So we try to mimic that by giving them mouth, giving the models mouth, right? So that they speak with moving mouth and talking to a parent or artificial parent, of course. But I think the world, the kind of the landscape will go into two directions. One is there's the engineering world that will continue to develop and continue to produce probably good models that will be great tools and will probably make good advances. But I'm also interested in the more scientific road and in a more scientific pathway where we use these models, make them as human as possible so that we can learn more about our intelligence and about animals. And what I mean by more about our intelligence, it's not just empty word. It's like if I'm building models of human language that are realistic, right? AI models, and they happen to have the same brain process. They happen to process sounds very similarly to us. What does that tell me about human, right? Can I do some sort of simulations, right? Stuff that is not possible in our human reality because there's some prohibited, obviously, experiments. Or is there something that is, at the end of the day, human specific, something that is unique human, some brain circuits that, they're not just arise with these models or in these models. So I think that it's a kind of false dichotomy where the models are becoming so different. We converge, but we come from different starting points. Yes, that's true for these larger models, but there's also room to experiment and build models and trying to mimic humans much more closely than the current large language models do to answer some of these questions. So I don't think we need to, I think there's so I've been trying to carve out that pathway, build realistic models, learn about humans. And then, in a sense, the reason why it's very, very exciting to be a linguist now is because these models started to perform well, and there are all sorts of things you can do, right? You can, take experiments that people have been devising in psychology for decades and train these models on and test the models on and learn what can emerge in a artificial computation. And that probably means that it's not uniquely human. And so in a sense, we're learning more and more about, the three intelligences now, if you want. It's a slightly false, again, slightly artificial division, but humans, animals, and machines, right, are now becoming the really serious object of study. And I think building more realistic models will definitely help us and kind of deal away with some of these objections that people have about AI, which is, they're very different. They're just not doing stuff like humans are, which is true.
Still seems like the fundamental dichotomy is concept first versus linguistic association first. Like my fundamental grievance when I told that short story about the carbon monoxide and the chemical equation that made no sense is that the LLM doesn't have a concept of what a chemical reaction stands for, which is a combination of atoms and blah, blah, blah. There's this physical process that happens, and the statement of the chemical reaction has to reflect that underlying reality, which is self-consistent. And so it doesn't really understand, it doesn't have that conceptualization to say what I'm telling you makes no sense. It's just seen it's kind of gluing together abstractions that it's found elsewhere and trying to put it in a format that looks like the ones it's seen before. But it seems like it's not, that's why it seems so dumb to me. Because it seems like that's a mistake that you wouldn't make in seventh grade, right?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, and there are people who think that LLMs are, and there are many people who think that there are large language models, precisely for the reasons you're saying, are, a blind alley, are not good models at all, and will never get us to whatever AGI or ASI. It's hard to say. I mean, predictions. I mean, I might agree. The problem is that they have caught us by surprise, and so many times, and we'll see continuous improvement, right? And the question. Okay. So now we're getting to the interesting part, because you've been like kind of pushing back a little bit. So what we're talking about right now is exactly the debate that people had about animal cognition. Okay? So you're saying these models inherently don't understand, and they're probably not going to be able to, or maybe they will, but currently they're just, some blobbing together some things that look,
they associate. Yeah, they associate
right.
really well.
This is exactly what Chomsky said about bonobos when he was right. So Sue Savage-Rumbaugh basically raised a bonobo called Kanzi, and it was a really interesting experiment. So bonobo Kanzi, his mother was primarily the target of teachings, of trainings. But just like in humans, it's way easier to learn implicitly from observation, right? So they were trying to train his mother, but the Kanzi, the bonobo baby, was around. And Kanzi picked up on language and many things, kind of in this implicit learning, and was able to do all sorts of different tasks, right? They would do experiments with Kanzi, and they would say, make the doggy bite the snake, or make the snake bite the doggy. Okay, so they were trying to see if there's linguistic structure in Kanzi. And if you think of, when you say a sentence, make the snake bite the doggy, or make the doggy bite the snake, there's no immediate reason why one animal would do the biting, right? And so it's about ordering of structure, linguistic structure, that tells you the agent from the patient, right? It's slightly different where, cut the onions with a knife. That's, in a sense, when you hear a knife and you hear an onion, the logic thing, if you're observing parents, is to cut the onion with the knife, onion with the knife, and not vice versa, right? But pour the Coke into water, or pour the water into Coke is not so obvious. Or make a doggy bite the snake, or vice versa. It's not quite the same. So
there's no hierarchy of function that's inherent in that.
Well, so that's okay. So people who were trying to say that animals can have language with this sort of cultural training, right? If we give our culture and our language to animals, bonobos are able to accommodate it, get the structure with roughly the equivalent of a 3-year-old child or 2-year-old child, right? So they would be saying, well, it's evidence of some basic structure that these models, that these bonobos have basic structure and they're able to do it. And the other side of the debate, which was, like generative linguistic grammar, Chomsky, Pinker, and other people who were very critical of animal studies, is that no, this is just, some sort of semantic soup. They call it semantic soup. The bonobo is able to, get the concept, hear the concept like a dog. If you say a ball to a dog, it'll know a ball, right? And are somehow in this semantic blob able to perform some tricks to get food. Okay, so it is an exact same debate that is happening now in LLMs. And you're saying that, they're performing tricks for food or like for some reward, and it is just semantic soup, and they're not really understanding it. And Sue Savage Rumbo would say, no, they're actually understanding it. There's structure in there. Um, for actually good ethical reasons, you cannot do that kind of research anymore, because bonobos are so cognitively advanced that it's ethically inappropriate. But that was a time in the history of science where people were doing it. And
Wait, what's unethical about asking a bonobo questions about snakes and dogs?
well, you have to take the bonobo from its natural environment, right? And they were kind of imposing our human culture on an individual that has cognitively so many things in common with humans that I think
So you'd have
it's
to
a
go
lot of
out to
harm.
the
It's a
bonobo.
lot of harm that you do to these animals in some ways, even if the intentions are good.
What was the outcome of the experiment, though? So was the
Yeah,
bonobo
so-
able to parse the hierarchy of like
yes,
snake
yes,
versus dog,
yes,
dog versus
yes.
snake?
But then the experiment had to end, and that they didn't test everything. But there were interesting things that came. They were able to show that they started to distinguish between patient and agent, right? So who does the action? Also in the way they were pressing. So they cannot vocalize as complexly as we do. So they were pressing on various different words, thumbs for words, and they were able to show that this kind of constituent order, so the ordering of elements, started emerging in Kanzian. And Irene Pepperberg's experiments are also very interesting. Irene, Alex the parrot, right? So Alex can do language, so it can vocalize really well. So at any rate, so the debate is exactly the same, and the jury is out in a way. I mean, I think we are biased towards thinking we're special, right? So what why am I a human? As a human, why do I think that I'm actually using structure, whereas a bonobo or a large language model is just using a semantic soup, right? I think that's a little bit of a human exceptionality. Yeah, maybe the distinctive part is the understanding, right? I can make a correct answer, and LLMs cannot. But animals in many of these simple tasks were able to do the correct answer, and LLMs are getting better and better. And so that really kind of questions is like, when I do reasoning, is there something brilliant and special the way I do reasoning and complex thought? Or is this just part of human exceptionalism, right? And I also have this semantic soup, and maybe, at the end of the day, I came up with the correct answer, but like nine times out of 10, it's also like 5 times out of 10 is also the wrong answer. So I think, I think studying these things together really kind of helps you.
Shiloh and I
kind of
have
make
both
that.
have questions. Go first. I talk too much.
I don't know. I don't actually have a question, but I can reflect on my own intuition about this, which is that I'm much more in the camp of the bonobos, and humans are on one process and the LLMs on a different one altogether, because I have encountered animals being stupid, but they're stupid in a very different way than the LLMs are stupid.
Like our cat doesn't have object permanence. Like you can play with something. Like imagine you have like a bottle cap, And so you're sitting on the table and there's a newspaper on the table, and she'll like bat at the bottle cap, and then you put it under the newspaper and she's like, where'd it go? And
Or like move the food bowl 10 feet to the left or something.
she always keeps going back to the same place. So like clearly things misfire, and there's a certain type of faulty cognition that happens inside of animals. My question though comes down to actually the nature of questions. Like when you're teaching a child something, the question is always why. You tell them something and they're like, why? And then you have to continuously go down this path of explaining the more and more complex thing. And foundationally, it seems like humans have where we have some kind of module inside of us that's like, what we want to do is we want to understand cause and effect. Like we're really obsessed with that. And we've even gotten to the point where, a few centuries ago, it'd be like, well, because God said so. And now we're like, okay, well, let's figure out what the atoms are doing or whatever. And so I'm like, has Alex the parrot or Kanti the bonobo or any of these other animal experimentalist situations, have they ever asked why?
Oh, that's an interesting question. No, I think, yeah. So that we go back to curiosity as one of the, maybe our reward system is constructed around curiosity, whereas for animals it's mostly food, right? And it's true, most of the time you have to give food, you have to give food to the animals to perform the tricks for you. So some of the arguments on that side of the debates are definitely true, but also I think these are now really complex territories, right? Evolutionary, what makes, like, obviously finding food or getting food for performance is what you have, and maybe in humans that is less of an issue, right? Because we have an abundance of food, and we have time to think about more complex things. I don't know.
We must have been asking why. Like, okay, so I have kind of a theory of the way that creatures evolve, which is that they evolve along the line of what is their unique capacity. Right? So you have, if we go back in evolutionary history, you come to a branch point in the tree. And so there's some universal common ancestor of all of the mammals, right? And so it had some primordial version of the dog, the cat, the fish, the mollusk, like, I guess those aren't mammals. Let's say animals. Let's go back farther. The last common ancestor of animals. And along the evolutionary tree, each creature figured out some, dare I say, question to ask about the world that allowed them to differentiate from this common ancestor. Like, there's just no other way that I can imagine it working, because like you have to look at evolution and the diversity of species and ask the question of like, okay, well, why are there all these different species? And you can be like, oh, well, it's evolutionary pressures in the niche, and so they're just kind of like pushing each other out of the way, and gradually they evolve towards having different beaks and sensoriums. And I'm like, okay, that's possible. But it's also possible that there's like an inherent tendency of like groups of that universal common ancestor to start to do things differently, like kind of these proto-cultural differences.
Curiosities.
And I think that the human tool set that emerges is that we come from some group that basically was like, okay, well, we're going to be curious about the world, and we're going to continuously push our technological ability forward, because I look around at humans now and I'm like, this is insane. Like the built environment that we live in.
Right.
Like you can come up with all sorts of models of how humans and animals are similar, and clearly they must have thought, and clearly they must have consciousness, and still arrive at like, what the fuck is this?
We
right?
We fly plane. Whenever I'm on an airport, like, just like the airport is the most obvious thing to me. It's like we fly planes, and we have this giant. Yes,
$300 million machines that we just climb on into the sky. Yeah, it's unbelievable.
But no, I agree with that. I think to me, more of a question. The question is more of like, why did brain capacity increase so much in the evolution from, say, our last common ancestor to us? It was, but if you think of it, it probably was some sort of evolutionary advantage, because there are about a couple of thousand bonobos and chimpanzees currently, and we have, as you mentioned, not only built environment, like there are 9 million people, which is magnitudes more than there are bonobos and chimpanzees. So and actually our brain is a very energy hungry apparatus, right? And we bonobos are born and they're small and they cannot survive the environment for a few years, but our kids cannot survive the environment. When do they become energy independent, right? 10 years, 12 years or more. In elephants it's 6 years, in whales it's 6 years. So these are all kind of these things of kind of things that are predictive of the intelligence we kind of value about. But I don't know about this curiosity. I in my opinion, it's more of a feature of kind of higher intelligent animals, however you want to define that. It appears to be related to how socially how our societies in animals work. So if crows are very smart and very intelligent, and I think they're also curious. Or it's again difficult to define these things, but crows are the moms are with kids for 2 years, right? Which is very long. Chickens are like 3 weeks, right? So these are all this rearing period. How long are the children in the nest? And I think that is definitely one thing that is important. And but the question is still like, why, as our brain, we don't have large brain, but we have powerful brain, right? As these things expanded, like how, is it the curiosity just amplified, or self-awareness just amplified, or was there something else? Now, going back to this camp, there was this kind of more radical position that actually human language is really exceptional, and which is the idea that there was actually one single genetic mutation that allowed it in the history of evolution. And I don't really believe that, and many people don't, but there is this idea that language happened 100,000 years ago. It was catastrophic. It was one or two genetic mutations, and that's where then you get culture. That's where you get all these artifacts, the booming of Homo sapiens, and so on. So there is a radical.
Who champions that argument?
Sorry?
Who was the champion of that argument?
Well, mostly Chomsky, and the model of language evolution there. Language evolution is one of the best questions in science, because there's almost no direct evidence, right? So we don't have recordings. We have zero ideas of what was happening. We have some genetics. We have some fossils, but it's a lot of speculation. Now,
you were saying something really crazy before, I think, when we talked earlier, which was that it predated the concept of evolution in a biological sense. Like, people understood that languages evolved before they understood that species evolved. That's pretty nuts.
Yes, yeah, right. Well, that's just way we kind of that's actually an interesting it's an interesting meta-linguistic history of science bit, right? So we humans can do meta-linguistics, right? We can reason about language. And at the time where people were like, they didn't know what species are, right? I mean, they didn't know how evolution happened. People started realizing that there are languages that are closely related to each other. And the most obvious thing, the most catastrophic thing that happened was people went to India, right? So British went to India and they started learning the sacred language of Indian texts, which is Sanskrit. and they realize that it's super close to Greek and Latin. And then they realize, oh, there's the evolution, right? So, there was a mother language that is called Proto-Indo-European now that gave rise to all these languages, and that proto-language no longer exists, right? So, another nice case of human curiosity, but that was just like, metacognition, right? Finding our evolutionary path. But in terms of like, how and why we developed language and how and why we developed our intelligence, those are, I think, very difficult questions, and we'll need some more time. Models can help there as well, right? I can build agents now of realistic AI models and play with them, and see what they evolve, right? And I think we vastly underestimate culture. We focus on, our human brain power. We focus on the evolution of biology, but culture is, I think, extremely important, right? And I think we need to understand that, parallel to biological evolution, we have culture, and we're not the only ones that have culture. Animals have culture as well, but we accumulate knowledge. We have language that can transmit information in time and so on. And then there's a really good question like culture and biological evolution, how they work together. There's a lot to be discovered there, I think.
Hey folks, quick interruption. Remember, this podcast is entirely supported by listeners like you. That means we work directly for you, and we are not selling you anything other than what we do here. So if you'd like to see that continue, please come over to patreon.com/demystifysci and see how you can get involved in supporting the project. And of course, we will give you more of our time, and we will meet up every week at our patron chat, discuss what's going on, and I'd love to see you there. So check it out, patreon.com/demystifysci. Back to the conversation.
When you were talking about the consonant clusters earlier, I was thinking that the word in Russian for to shudder is vzdr starts the word, so it's vzdragnul,
Right.
which I think is the longest consonant cluster that I've encountered in the languages that I know.
There are languages, Nukhalk in Canada, that have words with no vowels at all.
How is it?
Isn't Hebrew like that?
No, Hebrew is
No.
written without the vowels.
Oh, they're there, but they're
They're
not.
there.
Yeah.
They're kind of like when you're learning Hebrew, there's like little dots and stuff above the letters and below them to tell you what vowel is supposed to be there, and then
But ancient Hebrew wasn't like that.
well, even like as an adult, when you read the newspaper, it doesn't have the dots anymore. It's just like a learning tool for kids.
No, it was not. It was never without vowels. It was just not. They were not written. But that in Nukhalk you have words that don't have vowels at all. And basically, what happens?
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, like what does that sound like?
Well, it's hard for me to even pronounce it. But like, what happens is instead of the vowel, there's the fricative. So, for example, takes the role of the vowel. So you can say something like tst or k, right? And that what we call the syllabic peak. So the syllable become the center of the syllable that is in our languages is usually the vowel becomes s or a fricative of a sound of a kind.
It's like a different kind of resonance, a very like a higher frequency resonance that's sustained.
It's not about a frequency as much as it is about the degree of aperture, right? So vowels are the most open sounds, right? When you say an ah, you kind of open your jaw. A lot of air passes through it, and your vocal folds vibrate. Okay. Now, if you say have a little less aperture, it's like I, yeah, right? Are those consonants that have a lot of aperture but less than vowels? And then if you think, when you say air still travels to your nose, or when you say for example, in English, when you say button, the n is basically the vowel, right? Button. or the N acts as a vowel. And then, the more you make constriction, the more you close your vocal tract, the so-called less resonant the vowel becomes. So s, sh, those are fricatives. You have just a narrow opening when you send your air through it, and vibration noise happens, from tiny turbulence of your air. And then the end point of those, closing your vocal tract is just complete closure. And those are called stops, like p, t, and k.
But isn't it's not a vocal cord sound, but it is a resonance with your teeth and your tongue, and there's a standing high pitched tone there. There's probably a complex tone with multiple high pitched tones.
Like, if you were to frequency analyze it, the sound of s is much higher than the sound of ah.
Correct. Yeah.
I think that's what Shiloh was saying, that it's high frequency.
Yeah. Right. So S is noise, and you're right. So the gravity, the center of gravity of that frequency is higher than vowels, which is like about 100 times per second your vocal fold vibrate, or 200. So that's the vocal fold vibration rate. And you're right, for fricatives, it's also the degree of aperture. So you close your part of the vocal tract, like it can be at the lips, it can be at the teeth, it can be, further in the velum, like or in English, at the glottis. And what happens is, when you narrow your passage of air enough, when you send it, the turbulence happens, and that turbulence produces noise, right? And you're right that it has a lot of high pitched stuff, because
it's like filtered noise, basically.
Exactly.
You're just sort of like bypassing the noise, essentially.
Yep. So the whole human speech is conceived as the source filter production, right? So it's the so-called source filter theory. You have the source, which is either the noise of frication or vocal tract, and then you change the shape of your vocal tract to filter, right?
It sounds so much like modular synthesis to me. Like, I'm a big music nerd, and like designing synthesizer music is the same exact principles. I'm like, everything you're describing applies to how you would build a sound on a synthesizer as well. Source tone, noise mixer, envelope filter. That's it, pretty much.
And what language is, in a sense, we can break it down to this extreme, to extremes. It's muscle movements of your articulators, such that the sound those articulators or muscle movements produce carries information. Okay, I think of a red apple in my brain. I come up with some information. Let's say red apple. I have learned to move my mouth so that the air that I'm sending my air through my articulators, that produces sound, and those vibrations that travel to your ear carry information. And then if you are able to, your mind brains vibrate, that gets translated into electric signal in your brain. And if you're imagining a juicy red apple right now, we have successfully communicated, right? My information through muscle movements gets encoded into sound, and you are able to decode that. Now, there's also sign languages, right? You can have signs instead of sounds, so there's a different modality. But if you think of it, in sign language, right, we have muscle movements as well, right? The modality is different only in the reception part, like we can see and versus hear, but in the production, it's all about muscle movements that carries information from our brain. Now, there's interesting, actually, we were talking about language evolution, how it evolved and why it evolved. When we speak, we gesture a lot, right? And it's unclear what evolved first. Actually, there's Kat Hobiter and the team works in a really interesting research on observing bonobos and chimpanzees in the wild. And they have a very, again, our human-centric views was focusing on their vocal communication, which is not that complex. But if you look at them in non-captive environments, they have a very complex set of gestures. And so there are models of language evolution that says gesture evolved first, and then vocal communication kind of co-evolved. I'm not saying, I don't know if there's any real evidence in favor of one or the other, but there's the gesture is definitely a companion to our vocalizations.
And the vocalizations have this emotional layer to them too, right? There's a tonal component, a musical component to it all as well. Like I've heard theories that music evolved prior to language or something like that. I mean, I tend to think they probably came together, but it's like that's the main difference when I'm listening to you describe this is that you're talking about language communicating a specific kind of information, which is like this declarative, abstract information. Whereas with a synthesizer, I can't really do that. But I can communicate something because I can make music with it. What the hell is that? Like, what kind of information is being communicated in music that also comes into language as well?
Well, superficially emotional information, right?
Yeah, very high level emotional information.
Social information. I can, you pick up a phone, you say hello, I can probably guess your gender, your age, your socioeconomic background. There's
whether you're having a good day or not.
Right. So there's speech is very very rich. But so are signs, right? So sign languages have what we have with pitch, for example, right? The pitch is the rate with which vocal folds vibrate, and it can carry meaning, linguistic meaning. It can carry also social or mood meaning. In sign language, you have, for example, eyebrows, and you raise them and you lower them, and it works in a very similar fashion as our vocal fold vibrations. So this idea of how it's the reason why I'm a linguist in a way is because I'm really fascinated by this question of how language evolved and what it is and how it works, but like also how it evolved, right? And why it evolved. And those are difficult questions. And people have, Aristotle wrote about it or like asked about that question, 2,000 years ago. And there's an interesting kind of evolution of the field where people have been speculating so much that at some point the Paris Society of Linguistics says, that's it, we're not publishing anything about language evolution anymore because you guys are just speculating. And then we have this, very interesting proposals about, I mentioned like one genetic mutation, catastrophic event not so long ago versus this gradual, increase in computational power of our brain that gradually allows language. And they were like, there's a gradual evolution. There's work on genetics. There's work, I think that'll tell us a lot. But also now we have these artificial, machines, these artificial machines that we can build and kind of play with in simulations in a way that you can't in humans, right? You can't do many experiments that because that would be ethically impossible. So it's a very, very interesting
one thought that pops into my head as you're speaking about this is why in the world there are so many different languages as opposed to having evolved a universal language by this point, which it seems like that's more in the direction of what the LLMs are doing. But there's something very special about language amongst humans that, it's not so obvious perhaps why to this day I don't see there being any sign of that slowing down. Maybe there is, but.
Well, so that's an interesting question. So language evolves a lot, right? So from, you can probably not read Old English, or you would understand very little. And it's like 1,000 years ago that it happened. The idea of linguists was that language is not actually that different. It's in the content that is, like the way the words sound, like the way the word for cheese is cheese in English and sir in Slovenian. Yeah, that's different. But there's a word There's a cheese, there's consonants and vowels, there's verbs and nouns and so on. So the idea of the linguists since, the 50s and 60s is that there is universal language. Again, that camp that says language is pre-available, right? The intuition or like the predisposition for language, we come pre-born with it. That idea will say, well, languages are actually in the structure extremely similar. It's just the way we choose to use that structure, or individual languages choose to use that structure. Now, one of the most fascinating discoveries in the history was that language develops in a regular fashion. Okay? So that is something that was mind-blowing when I heard it for the first time in my undergrad linguistic course. What does it mean? It means, okay, so you have sounds in words and you have words, right? And if one sound in Old English develops into another sound, this change will happen in every single word of English. Okay? So, for example, if you take a word for father in Latin, it's called pater, right? And it's called father in English. If you take a word for foot, it starts with a F, right? Word for foot and word for English for Latin pot or or Greek pous, right? The word for put has P there. So people started realizing, okay, everywhere I have an English or Germanic word for F, Greek and Latin have a P. And that was revolutionary. That is what, brought, in a sense, catalyzed evolutionary theory, because people are realizing, okay, it's systematic. Every time there's a P in Latin, there's an F in Germanic. And Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were the Grimm brothers who came up with all these, who collected all the fairy tales, but they were also linguists. And Grimm's law is one of the first of this kind of law where it shows the systematic relationship between sounds. So in Proto-Indo-European, there was a P that remains a P in Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, but it becomes an F in Germanic, right? And then I bring Pita is the word for father in Sanskrit, right? That's where people started realizing this cannot be a coincidence. Pita, pater, mata, mater, right? And then not only they found similarities, they found systematic similarities, and they found sound laws. So if P goes to F in Germanic, it'll go to F. We will go to F in every single word. Now, what you can cleverly do then is you take all the languages, right? Because those sound changes are usually going in one direction, and you can kind of reason about them. You can understand why P would go to F. You can basically take languages and reverse engineer, because they're systematic, because sound change or the change of sounds happen in every single word completely systematically. You can reverse reconstruct how the proto-language sounded like 6,000 years ago without having any recordings of of the language. And that was the invention of the 19th century science. And the first similarities were observed by some people earlier probably, but Sir Jones addressed the British Scientific Society and said, like, this cannot be a coincidence. It's either God-given, it's a coincidence which it cannot be, or there is a common ancestor. And then Darwin, a couple of decades later, uses those examples to say, look, if we can't believe that words develop that way, why not species? So, linguistics, in a sense, created this notion of evolution that was then applied to language, to animals. But so, this is, to me, so mind-blowing. And this allowed this kind of reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European. And this is how I started my undergrad, and half of my graduate career was just studying all dead Indo-European languages, some of which have fabulous texts. And the cultures you learn when you learn those languages are just amazing. You have Rig Veda, the Gathas of Zarathustra, Hittite legal texts, Tocharian Buddhist translations. So Indo-Europeans were this interesting, peoples who kind of expanded from a relatively small tribe in the steppes of what is now probably Ukraine to Germanic and Indic and Tocharian and all the other branches. And studying those languages those dead languages is how you can then reverse engineer the proto language, and you can learn about their culture. You can learn how are the Proto-Indo-Europeans, what their lives were, because you can reconstruct what the names for trees are. And if a name for a tree is not a borrowing, so if they had a name for a birch tree that is the same in all languages and is the old Indo-European word, then probably they had birch trees. They had lakes. They had a dog. They domesticated the horse, crucially, and that's probably what allowed them to spread so much so fast.
I mean, did they displace lots of other languages? Because it seems to me that it's easy to confuse a people with a language that people speak as well. Like if you look at English, it's spoken all over the world right now, but it's spoken by all sorts of different peoples. Like, I don't know, my mind immediately goes to the Sumerians, who have this really weird language that kind of hangs on in the midst of all this Indo-Europeanization.
Yeah.
But did they represent just one of many different other languages that just completely disappeared off the map and was displaced because Proto-Indo-European was just really popular and good for trade? Or
I think that brings us to your initial question: why are languages so different? Okay, so there are a couple of things. One of the things is you wanna express your social identity through language, right? If you say about, you're probably Canadian, and if you wanna signal that you're Canadian, you're probably gonna say about a lot, right? And so we have desire to express social identity, and we do that through language a lot. And so then you get into this complex situation, right? So we used to think that we like to think that humans only travel now, right, with planes. But back in the day, there was a lot of trade, a lot of traveling. People were moving back and forth, and there were peoples replacing other peoples. And there's called the contact linguistic. What happens when one language becomes in contact into another? And there are different things that can happen. Like, they say Indo-Europeans could just completely wipe out another people, but that's not usually what happens. There was intermixing of groups, intermarriages, and then kids are sometimes they are bilingual, and then one language just starts influencing the other, right? And then
it seems like it's deeply tied to the construction of empires and states and so forth as well. I'm not sure that's the only means by which it spreads, but it seems like there might be some enforcement with regard to the legal code, the documentation of trade, stuff like that, where it would behoove you to use a particular language set because it would protect you financially or something like that.
Right. Like, for example, in Slovenia in the 19th century, right? People spoke Slovenian, but all the legal and all the education was in English, in German, and so there's huge influences on German and Slovenian, or there's a million cases like that. French vocabulary in English, or Danish vocabulary in English, right? The word for sky is Danish. The word for court is French, right?
In our legal system, we still use the Latin, right?
Right.
So this holds over.
So there's many relationship that when two language groups come into contact, they can influence each other, and then that all causes language to change, right? And if bilingual children learn both languages, one language influences the other, and then they continue that. So languages are, they're learned vocalization, and that's the beauty about learned vocalization, right? That's the beauty of birds that have learned bird song, or or as humans or other animals that have learned vocalizations, because they're very adaptive to change, right? And they have this the ability to express social meaning through them, right? So birds have those bird songs that are learned. They have dialects, right? They will different regions will sing differently, and if a bird is not exposed to a bird song early enough, they will never master the bird song fully. Just like a human who during childhood for some horrible reason would not be exposed to human language will never master it fully.
Or just foreign language speakers won't be able to master an accent perfectly, right?
Exactly.
With
So
the
there's a
birds,
so-called
hold on,
critical period.
the critical period is important for the learning of languages. Is it also critical for being able to distinguish these different dialogues?
Well, the dialect, it's very difficult to distinguish a dialect from a language. There've been attempts, but it's all kind of a continuum, and then politics start playing a role, right? So you have these cases where
But in the case of let's say let's take the politics out of it and look at the case of birds. So you're like, there's bird song that is different in different regions, and so they have these dialects. And so if you take the dialect of one region and you play it for a bird of a different region, does it respond to it, or does it treat it as bird song that's not its own?
Oh, that research, I don't actually know. If I have a feeling that it has been done, but I wouldn't be surprised if actually birds would know that there is a different dialect. Definitely other species do, and there's a lot of this, again, this culture and social meaning that, as I mentioned before, we try to kind of sweep away and not think about a lot in science oftentimes, unfortunately. But it's definitely there, and there is a role that okay, so one of the big debates, again, camps in linguistics is whether language is shaped and changes and is the way it is because our brain wants it so, or is it for communication efficiency and the fact that language is transmitted in space and time, right? So if I want to say a word, it's very hard for you to hear that word, right? Whereas say a word pick, in PTK versus PIK, right? If I add a vowel there, it's going to be much more easy for you to decode a word pick versus a word pk, right? Now the question is this all just communication efficiency and the fact that k is unstable and pick is stable, and language is transmitted in space and time, right? That's why it also changes. Every single kid needs to learn language completely anew. And so that's more of a cultural transmission influences on language. Whereas the other side would say, well, no, there's also the fact that we need to learn those things with our human brain. And maybe learning biases, these cognitive biases, dictate us to use pick more as opposed to pk. So,
and that could be the cause of the Indo-European supremacy, as it might have just been more practical than whatever was there before. If it allowed you
there were never in language. There is no supremacy. They were never better in language.
That's actually it's probably a terrible word to use. I don't think. God, why did I even use that word? I just mean that it seems to have become popular and widespread. This
I think that was because of the horse. It had nothing to do with language.
Whoa. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there are theories about how they spread and why they spread, but there's nothing about language that allowed them to spread. It just, I think what happens is they domesticated the horse first, and that is huge, right? If you think of the world in the 2500 BCE, having a horse or not is like having a tank versus having no tanks. And that
But
allows,
even to like tie it into culture too, if you think about it, the adoption of English, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that America is really good at cultural exports of things that people wish to aspire to.
Right.
And so you make a Hollywood movie, and that movie ends up being transmitted to the rest
We
of the
have the
world.
horse.
And yeah, I'm like, is the horse like the Hollywood movie where somebody shows up riding a horse and you're like, oh my God, I want to learn how to ride the horse. And it happens that the guy speaks Proto-Indo-European and you're like, okay, my fate is sealed.
But it has nothing to do with language. If all the U.S. spoke Slovenian, it would have the same horse and the same Hollywood. It would just be different languages.
Yeah.
It seems like to answer that question, though, you'd have to know what the competing languages were at the time of the infantile Proto-Indo-European language.
Okay.
Because
so you're opening a very interesting question. Okay, the child is born and can hear and learn any possible human language. Okay, from month 0 to 7, a child hears every human sound possible of language. Okay, so I'll give you an example. In the Caucasus, there are adjective consonants. So we say P and B in English, pa, ba. In Caucasus and in North America, you have adjective sounds, which sounds like ba, ah. So you close your glottis and you say your P, okay? And a lot of the times for English, you won't hear, if you're an English speaker, you won't hear that distinction very well. Another example is pool versus pull, right? So one is a swimming pool, one is something you pull. I don't hear that distinction really well because oo and oo are very similar sounds. And my kids always make fun of me because I change them. And the thing is that from 0 to 7 months, infants are able to hear all those possible differences. Okay, if you put an infant and raise it in Caucasian language or in Slovenian, it'll learn that language. It'll learn it. So it's able, but even if you play a sound, in English home, if you play a sound, adjective sound to that kid that, it's hard to hear for you now, the kid will hear it. Now from month 7 to 11, that that ability to listen to everything starts closing. And you start listening only things that are meaningful in your language. So I was able to hear pool versus pool when I was 7 months. When I turned 11 months, that pool distinction was gone, and I cannot hear it anymore because it is non-existent in Slovenian. In Slovenian, pool and pool makes no meaning distinction. In English, of course, it does. And so you were able to continuously hear that because your brain was narrowing down on things that are important in English. All of the other things are politics, but there is nothing inherent about language that allows you to expand or be more sufficient as a society. There are, of course.
By the way, when you say politics, you just mean the tribalism inherent in making exclusive boundaries on your ability to communicate, something like that.
Right. I mean, that's all politics. There's
gotcha.
nothing about language. I mean, there is a line of thought, of course, that says, the way we speak, our language, the language you speak affects your either thought or other things, and that goes back to Wittgenstein, and it's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, right? And it's maybe a flavor of this idea of what language is in relationship to thought, but the idea is that if you think of language and thought as being inseparable, it's possible that the language you speak, if you have a word for X, maybe you think more about that concept, right?
Or you
As
can
opposed
think poorly about concepts that way too. Like Hayakawa wrote this incredible book. I have it by my bed. It's just I reference it so often, but it's very easy, especially in science, to start to reify different concepts into actors and do insane physical processes to your concepts, and you can actually find yourself really far down the weeds quickly and thinking in a
or
broken manner.
if you have a word for blue or green, or you don't have a separate word for blue or green, is your perception of color different? I really like to avoid the debate.
I think that because as far as I understand it, like linguists come to blows over whether or not the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is something that you're even allowed to talk about, because it's got flavors of like social Darwinism, what cultures are good, what cultures are bad.
Can you all just lay out? I haven't heard that word before.
So Sapir-Whorf, there was a movie called Arrival a few years ago about these like aliens that come to Earth and they have this like link. Okay. And so the movie reinvigorated this debate, as far as I can tell, about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, because it was based on a story that made the case that the aliens thought differently because their language was different. And linguists, I actually got into a fight with somebody about this immediately afterwards, because I was like trying to talk about like, isn't it interesting that this could be the case? And they were like, you cannot say that. That's like...
Because there's like a values basement layer to this where it's like you all think improperly.
No, it's like, okay, so imagine it's like arbitrary situation. Let's say that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis proves that if you speak Arabic, you are better at basically all cognitive tasks. Therefore, Arabic becomes the superior language in a world that values your performance on cognitive tasks. And people don't, like, I think that humanities really don't like to put things in these hierarchies of like what language is better and what language is worse, which is...
This is why when I used the word superior, it was a complete landmine.
Supremacy.
Oh, supremacy.
Indo-European supremacy. But so, I've been thinking about what Shiloh said. And I've been thinking about what you said in terms of, okay, so you have this critical period where you can encounter these sounds, and then all of a sudden the ones that aren't meaningful, you stop being able to hear. And so I'm like, is there any indication that there are languages that babies prefer to speak because they're easier to make the sounds? And I think that that's what Shiloh was asking, where he was like, because my niece is, she's in this crazy international household. So she's learning Hindi, Russian, English, and Tibetan at the same time. And she's 2.
Right.
And so like she's in this soup of languages, and at this point she's kind of mixing all of the words together, and so like all sentences are jumbles of international languages. But I'm curious to know if there's one of those languages that is easier for her to speak because of the way that the vowels sit in it, or if that's just not a thing.
Not
like in terms
really.
of, can I just add that in terms of the practicality, like it seems like there are absolute situations where you want to be able to project your voice over long distances and you need that resonant vowel sound to pull it off. There's also really valuable situations where you don't want that and you whisper. And what is a whisper? But it's almost language.
Actually, well, that's a very interesting. There was a very interesting. There's very interesting research showing that some languages have vocatives. It's a case. It's a case like you have not for English that's a little bit now complex, but you have nominative and accusative in German, for example. And when you use the nominative case, like a child, or actually in English you have some of that, who versus whom, right? Who ate a banana versus I saw, whom did I see, right? Whom did I see versus who ate the banana. You use who when the agent of the when who is the agent of the clause, and you use whom when it's a patient, right? It's the thing that undergoes some action, right? Whom did I see? Now, so those are called cases. Okay, you take noun and you give you can put it in a different case. Some languages like Serbian and Proto-Indo-European actually have case for calling somebody. So you would say, a slightly different form of a noun when you address somebody. And it has been shown that those cases where you're used for addressing have more vowels because you need to, as you mentioned, according to this way. But what linguists like to some myths that we like to dispel is that there are easy languages and hard languages, or complex or simple. That is actually most likely or almost certainly not true. It is true that for English speakers, it is more difficult to learn a language that has cases. But that's just because, your English doesn't have cases and it's something new that you have to learn. When it comes to general complexity of the language, it also might be the case that some languages put more complexity on the sound aspect, and then they maybe have so it's just a question of where you embed your information, right? Do you have 50 different sounds or 100 different sounds, and then your words are going to be probably shorter, or you have fewer sounds, like Hawaiian have fewer sounds, and so your words will probably be longer. But it's not about a complexity. We roughly communicate with a constant rate of complexity, all human cultures, all humans. But it's a question of how exactly your language will encode that complexity. That can differ. Now, in terms of what is more difficult to learn, it's just more or less how close to your own language that X is. So those are some myths that linguists like to dispel. But it's important that there's a lot. That's how I was like when I was a kid. I knew I wanted to study linguistics since I was, I don't know, 8 years old. And one of the things I wanted to learn is like, what's the most difficult language? And then I realized there's no such thing. But you learn these other things, cool things about language. But it's more about where in your language you'll encode information as opposed to how complex it is.
That makes perfect sense. Does it actually give you a readout of the evolutionary time distance between you and the common ancestor of those people, depending on how difficult it is to learn their language?
Also, not really. So there are actually it's a very difficult problem to estimate. Let's say, when did Old English or when did Proto-Indo-European, when was it spoken exactly? And there are ways to do that. It's actually borrowing from biology, the phylogenetic tree analysis. Basically, you're treating every change in a word or in a sound system as a genetic mutation, and that gives you, some estimation of the time scale. There's also, you can then sometimes you can tie language to culture, but most of the time you can't. For example, there's like archaeological complexes, and you can say, oh, this was so Indo-European proto-language was spoken 6,000 years ago, and then it branched into many languages, right? You have Celtic, you have Germanic, you have Indo-Iranian, you have Baltic-Slavic. So in the Iranian branch, for example, you can tie it to a culture. Most of the time, they're called Andronovo culture or Bactria margiana archaeological concept. So then you can say, okay, in this area where I found this pottery, it's probably the case that these languages were spoken. Most of the time, you can't even do that because, again, the politics are messy, right? It's not simple. Oh, here was one language and then another language come, and the first language disappeared. You're like, people mix. They have various different levels of social prestige. Like, for example, you can write a whole book on social linguistics, or the way society was expressed in language of Hittite in Anatolia, 3,500 years ago, in what is today Turkey. So it's more complex than we like to think, but at any rate, these are all things that influence our language. And this concept of, as we mentioned, Sapir-Whorf, I just want to avoid it because I think there are more exciting things, and it's really difficult question to answer. Maybe colors are one good example, right? So if you have a word for color, are you able to see a color better? But even then, it's all behavioral research, and it's hard to make actual definitive answers to that.
The time thing is really interesting to me because I think that people are wising to the idea that evolution in a biological sense also happens in a step-like fashion. Like you would love to believe that there's an average rate of mutation and evolution is this nice steady state process, but the reality of the situation is you could have a lot of advancements in an organism, or by analogy in a language, all at once because of some circumstances that change all of a sudden.
Yes.
So I think that the time thing, to answer my own question,
and that's exactly the debates we have in linguistics, right? As Proto-Indo-European was developing to Sanskrit or to Latin, are there like triggering events that really make the language be different? And I think that might be the case actually. Let's say it's probably the case that Indo-Iranians came into contact with various, probably Dravidian languages. And so those catalyze that contact can catalyze a change, which kind of reshuffles. So you create one change, but that really has to reshuffle then your entire system. So it's possible that languages develop kind of catastrophically. Now, there is one important thing to distinguish. What I'm talking about here, about Proto-Indo-European and language P going to F and stuff like that, that's all historical linguistics. That is assumption that language is already evolved. It is very different line of inquiry from language evolution, right? And first, I'm interested how language evolved from last common ancestor to humans, whereas in historical linguistics, language is already there. It is exactly the same as it is now. 6,000 years ago, language was exactly the same as it is today. And I'm interested how it changes language already. But the evolution, it's sometimes easy to mix these two. The evolution of language is a whole new, ball game. It's
like the appearance of the ability to infinitely express abstract concepts.
Right.
That's one thing. We call it evolution. The other thing is just a metamorphosis of diversity of forms of that, it seems like.
Yeah.
You use the same word for both cases, though, which is catastrophic.
Catastrophic, right.
Can you elaborate on that? Because you said that language evolved for the first time about 100,000 years ago, and that was... Go ahead.
That some people think that. I would probably venture to guess that was not the case. Although it's very hard. One evidence they have is, cultural artifacts start appearing, cave paintings start appearing, about 40,000 years ago. So that's evidence of, symbolic computation that people started using, and that they tie that to language. Music is another thing, right? All cultures have music, but animals presumably don't. So this sort of cultural artifacts, or increase in tool use, increase in ornaments that happen. But it's so hard to say, because what if we just don't have evidence of what if 200,000-year-old paintings just don't survive, right? The other thing, so there is one view is language evolved catastrophically. The radical aspect of that view is it evolved from a single genetic mutation, which is very difficult to believe, but there is, the proposal is out there about 100,000 years ago, which allowed this complex, this process that some linguists called merge, and Chomsky called it merge, which is basically a recursive process where you can start, taking constituents and embedding them. And the idea is that our brain only allowed that a couple of 100,000 years ago with a single mutation. The other side of that spectrum is that it's a more gradual evolution, right? which genetics would support, right? There's not a single gene for language. There's like a even there is what we think is a so-called brain network. There's work by F. Fedorenko of language network in the brain. But it's multiple centers that conspire to do language, but it's genetics would speak in favor of the gradual evolution. And in general, the way evolution works, but it's really did Neanderthals have language? Who knows? I have no recordings of Neanderthals. I'm not sure if we'll ever know. There is nothing in the fossil. I mean, some people want to say, well, you can look at the fossils. What kind of complexity of vocalizations could Neanderthals have expressed? Right? Were they able to speak vowels and consonants with the same complexity? The same number of different sounds or not? But it's really it's really hard to.
Do they have symbolic representations in the form of art or symbology in other fashions? Written symbology of any sort?
That's a good question. Is there Neanderthal art?
I want to say there is, actually. I want to say that there's something at least related to burial ceremony. Well, there's this one guy who even goes further than Neanderthals.
That's true, yeah.
Back, the Homo naledi character, I forget his name, down in, what is it, South Africa? Yeah, there's problems with that guy. But he's trying to say that they had these complex burial rituals. Yeah. And it's hard to imagine there not being at least some proto-linguistic aspect to a ceremonial anything.
Well, is that true? I mean, you can have a ceremony without language, I think. I don't know. Animals have, like, they're grieving their deads, like elephants. And they don't have the same language as we do. I don't know. I think it's kind of difficult to, and
it's not a proof, certainly. It's
is language just, a binary? Like, you don't have language and then you do, or is just like, first you're able to express this, and then you start, coming with some rules where agent comes first, like maybe like Kanzi did, as it was, and like humans do, right? We don't learn syntax. It's not that at when you're 1 year old, you don't do syntax yet, but when you're 2, or like when you're 1 in a day, you start doing language in syntactic ways. So I think there's like stages. It's a continuum of expression complexity, and I've been going back and forth between these two ideas, but I would probably land more on the continuous gradual evolution of communicational complexity. Culture again, right? The communication gives you the ability to accumulate knowledge, and that maybe in turn can influence the way you behave. So all sorts of things. So how do we get to the bottom of this? Genetics, probably, brain science for sure, and playing with artificial models of language, right? So I can build the model that is as realistic as it can be from my lab and multiply it by 10 and see what they will come up with as they're learning. Are there pressures, general communicative pressures that can shape this kind of language? And again, some people will say, nope, not at all. And some people will say, yes, of course, it's just one gradual increase in communicational complexity.
The evidence for Neanderthal art is very sketchy.
Yeah.
Like there's groups that are like, yes, this is definitely Neanderthal art, and then you look at the art and you're like, I don't really know if that is what you say it is.
If that's art.
But I don't think that it goes the other way around. Like, I don't think that if you do art that you have to have language, and if you don't, you don't. I think it's just, we're so desperate because there's almost no direct evidence for language evolution that we cling on to things that
do you think that it's representative of something, though, which is this step towards an abstract relationship where you're like, there's this thing that's out there and I can make some marks and it represents it, which starts to kind of lend itself to this idea of there being the symbol and the symbolized, which is kind of necessary for language?
Well, Alex the parrot was able to distinguish green balls and blue squares once we were able to train it on language enough so that he would actually be able to do that.
I thought you were going to tell me that he was making cave paintings.
No, well, yeah, well, but bonobos and chimpanzees do have tool use. Alex the parrot. I mean, it was like concepts. Right? It's. I think it's more of just a matter of scale, right?
Are the parents communicating concepts to one another in the absence of humans imposing that upon them?
Probably not. Probably not. Yeah. And there's this whole
That's
idea.
shocking. That's shocking they would have the ability to do it and not utilize it.
Well, I think what Irene Pepperberg mentioned is that Alex was appearing to teach other parents how to do it. And she said like the way to train parrots is, have that interaction between two birds as well. But I don't have a lot of evidence that they're really communicating in our language. But the point is that maybe it's like what can a 1-year-old child do and what a 2-year-old child and 3, it's a matter of scale, right? And maybe again, it's the same fundamental, in a sense, philosophical question. Am I looking at this as a continuous and a scale thing, or is there something uniquely human that allows me to do reasoning, understanding, and so on?
Yeah, like is the chimp looking back at you and talking to its friends and saying this whatever hairless chimp communicates at the level of a 2-year-old in our culture? Like they, just because our priorities are different, and
Right.
we can make these computers that run Zoom calls and stuff, but maybe we can't do the cultural dance that the chimps would expect us to do, and therefore we would seem like morons to them.
And to the question that we opened, like that is really big and I think profound. What allowed us humans to move from objective, which is getting food and survive, to asking these other questions, or like to increase the brain power at a huge energetical cost, right? And maybe that didn't happen in other species, but like this question I don't have an answer to, and I'm maybe even formulating the question in a weird way, but like I think it's quite interesting that we were able to increase our cognitive capacity to the degree we did, and potentially was an evolutionary benefit, right? The ability to do causal reasoning obviously has that evolutionary potential, but like why did it happen in precisely the species that we are in, and how, and what are the mechanisms? And then you come to the then you look at language and say, okay, we do have this thing that is called language. Was that the thing, or is that language just kind of a consequence of increased power, right?
Yeah, it's a real chicken or egg question.
That is a real chicken or egg question, yes.
Isn't there some theories about the development of the brain that involve learning to cook our food?
The learning to what?
Learning to cook our food, where it's like when we figured out how to use fire, we were able to produce more calories per unit, which allowed us to be more efficient. And then I'm like, I can see a linear path where once you figure out, if you figure out efficiency, then, and that's something that you're an experimenter, you're a species that's kind of trying to figure out, that what you do from then on is you just continuously figure out things that are efficient. Right. And that's kind of what we're still doing right now, where it's like we talk about LLMs, and I'm like, well, doesn't that really just boil down to efficiency?
But if you're already efficient and you have like, a lot of, why didn't you also need language?
Well, because that's how you get more food more efficiently. Like, right? Because you're like, okay, so now we can eat more, but now we're like, okay, and you have enough of this cognitive step to be like, okay, well, if we can get more food, that means we can relax more, or we can spend more time painting caves, or we can, have a better life. It's this abstraction. And so then you develop language, and that's the thing that allows you to actually set out on this path that we're on right now. And it's like, obviously this is a just so story, because like nobody's sitting there, but it seems reasonable to me that that's a path that because I imagine a creature right now that doesn't have language, but figures out that, hey, life can get easier if I build technology. Right? Like I look at...
But then there are animals who are more efficient at getting food than we are, or not? Without language.
Have you ever been to the grocery store and just thought about the amount of calories on a shelf? Like,
well, no, this is now talking about here and now, but like humans had like they were living in communities of a couple of other conspecifics, and they didn't have supermarkets yet.
Well, they did figure out how to kill these enormous beasts, though, right? Like these mammoths. I mean, that's like a little tiny hairless ape to take down this giant tusked beast.
But hyenas can, I mean, there's cooperation for sure. And maybe language is just an amazing way to cooperate. But I think it's also, there's so difficult questions.
Like I remember reading about this incredible case, and I don't know who did the study, but they found this funnel that some prehistoric peoples, I want to say this was like 20,000 years ago, that they'd set up basically to funnel these mammoths off of a cliff, and they built this whole barrier system to pull it off, and there's all these bones at the bottom. I'm like, that would be really hard to organize a group of people to pull off. Like, it's not just like hyenas, like, tracking down one animal that's kind of old and decrepit, and you just chew at its legs until it falls over.
Have you seen how dolphins and orcas fish?
Mm-hmm.
That's incredible too, right?
Yeah.
And it makes me think of a few months ago, there was this video that was going around about a team of ants versus a team of people passing this irregularly shaped object through a series of obstacles. And the ants could do it just as efficiently as the humans who could talk were able to do it.
Right.
And so I'm like, clearly there's something about group coordination that doesn't demand complex language, but it's fascinating, right? Because there's something inherent about humans.
Or they have complex language and we're just not privy to it.
Are you trying to tease the next conversation?
Yeah,
already?
yeah, maybe we can point at that. Yeah, I mean, I know you're doing some really cool research that you have to keep under the lid for now with respect to animal language. Is there anything you can tease people with about that? Because we're definitely going to have you back to discuss that paper when it comes out in a couple of months.
Well, I think one thing I can say is just very hard, because there are these questions that you have to kind of. It's a philosophical position that you have to take, right? I mean, there's this empirical world, right? You can make this, new discoveries. You can find things. You can study animals. But then the conclusions you make are really depending on where in that position you're standing, right? And it's a philosophical position at this point. We do not have answers to those, and it's gonna be great when we do, right? It's gonna be great if we figure out that there is something uniquely human, or it would be great to figure out that it's just the scaling. But before that, there's a philosophical position that you have, and it really makes you question these precisely things. What is intelligence? Like, how do we define ourselves? Like, if ants can do something more efficiently than we do, what does that tell me? But also, we have planes and ants don't have planes, right? And we've built all these things, and
thank God for that.
It's in a sense, it becomes a confusing word that you enter. It's actually much nicer to be focused on humans only, right?
Yeah.
And believe our exceptionality, and believe that we only have, it's only us who have the complex thought, and it's only us who have language, and it's only us who do the reasoning, and it's only us who can actually answer a question of like what atoms do, and all these, cause and effects things. And then again, I know you've been steering away for a little bit from the AI conversation, but I think that is kind of teaching us some things about humans as well, right? So And in my opinion, if anything, it's suggesting that scaling is the answer and not something uniquely, especially humans, right? And then you can think of, and then you start thinking of yourself, oh, maybe I'm just a computation. What's the difference between my biological computation in the brain and an approximation of that, in a mathematical approximation of that we outsource and train in sand? And I don't know, maybe you have better answers than I do. I think we're more efficient. We still have many more synapses than the large language models have connections or like parameters. We're way more efficient, energy efficient. But is there anything unique about my brain and my way of processing information compared to animals and machines? I think it's more of a scale and more of a focus, right? As a human, I don't have to search for food anymore, so I can all the time, so I can do other things. And as machine, currently, it's just predicting next token, right? When you're prompted. But can we build them bigger? Can we increase? If it's just a matter of scale, then we're all just one computation, and it's just a matter of how big you are and how powerful computation, how much information you can process. And I really think that is not a bad model. And I think we need to value biological computation more and more. And I think we need to put more value into our biologicity, because I think we're gonna I think even if LLMs are not better than us yet, we're starting to realize that maybe we're not so special anymore, right? And even that realization,
at least with respect to our ability to do calculus or something, for sure.
Right. But I think that realization itself, even if it's not true, even if they're not better yet and never will be, they're starting to threaten our primacy. And I think that's not bad. I think we'll be able to find, values and focus on values that I think we should have been focusing for a long time, and we've kind of forgotten. But I think
I personally just wonder whether biological thought processing or biological computation doesn't operate in a very different way than in silicate processing, in that there's this distributed ability to do calculations. Particularly if certain brain structures are destroyed, you can sort of pick up the slack elsewhere in the hardware in a way that I don't see necessarily possible in silicate. And I wonder if that distributed, decentralized computation gives rise to the sensations that we attribute to emotion, where there's these standing resonant patterns that either have pleasant or unpleasant discordant resonance throughout the computational circuit in a way that gives us the ability to orient ourselves towards our particular solution set that isn't just limited to quantitative computation.
Okay, so there are a couple of things that we take for granted now, but will not be true in the future. So the models we talk about, again with AI, there's currently single big models. They're not competing for resources yet, but they will soon. They're not interacting with each other yet, but they will soon. And I can tell you that pretty soon AI models will develop their own language that we will not be able to understand. At least if we start training them in as an agent and they start interacting with each other. Our language is made for biology and is in many ways very slow and inefficient. And that will happen fast. So that's one thing. The other thing is maybe we have some ways of distributing our processing better, or different ways, but we have to learn everything anew in a very slow rate, right? We are born We need to learn language. We need to learn all information, and then we lose that information because we die. Biology always dies. They will not. That's not the case. You can copy paste weights and continuously trade on different. So there's separability between software and hardware, which in biology we don't have the privilege of. Combining that and combining the fact that you can, train millions of such agents who will start competing for compute resources. So kind of emulation of evolution will arise. Who knows what can happen? I'm not saying that it will happen, and I don't think it'll happen very soon, although approximations differ. But there are some inevitable advantages of the sand intelligence compared to biological intelligence that will be very difficult to control at some point. But at any rate, I think in a sense there will be division of worlds, and I think as humans we will put a ton of more value into the biological processing of information, even if they never overpass us, because I think for the first time in history we're threatened. We were never threatened by any animal in real sense, right? I mean, of course, a lion can kill you, but in terms of our human collective intelligence, will survive probably, and if any species survives, or if any species goes to Mars, it'll probably be us. But now I think it's
Or
really
bacteria.
exciting to be. It's not just science fiction anymore. I think as humanity, we are threatened, or at least some of us are, and that really can help you reorient yourself. And so this is a little bit more forward-looking scenario, but I think even with the existence of that scenario, we're gonna put more value into biology because maybe it's mortal, because it has emotion, because it's bad and flawed, and in so many ways. But that also means all the other animals, right? So it's not just us who are on top anymore. It's like us. There's the artificial computation that has these obvious advantages, and the other is not just the human now or the animal. The other is now the entire biological world. So I think
hope
that's
you're right.
inherently good.
I hope you're right about that. I'm afraid someone will discover the root of curiosity and find a way to feed it to the machine somehow. Like if it really just comes down to checking inconsistencies in the whole body of knowledge inside of yourself, then it might be that the computers could be trained to have these emotional responses, these anxieties about inconsistencies in their universe, and really become motive agents that are trying to make a more self-consistent world for themselves.
I think as long as we can, we will put value on biology. Though it's like it's a similar debate to lab grown versus natural diamonds. If a machine can, if a machine can come up with a better mathematical proof than we can, we'll probably take their answer and use it. But for other things, we have a lot of our society has a lot of values, right? Art is one such thing. And we value art because it's made by humans and it has a human experience and it has a story, right? We're essentially storytellers. Now, would I read a story? I mean, in practical terms, there are now you can create a podcast of your paper with AI, right? And first it shocks you how good it is, but after 2 or 3 years, they really want to listen to the same sort of lifeless, no story behind podcast. I lose interest very quickly. But it's I think there's gonna be value system that will focus on our emotions, our experiences, our stories. Language, maybe we will keep our language, and machines will start communicate with their own set of protocols and just communicate with us in our language because that's the only language we will understand. in a similar way where we have trained Alex the parrot to give us insight into its own intelligence.
A
But
1,000 years from now, the computers are having a podcast and they're debating whether or not humans have thoughts.
But I think that's what we're
Yeah, no,
doing in
it's like-
conversation fundamentally is checking inconsistencies in our knowledge bases. Like that's why I love podcasting and talking to brilliant people is because I get to dig up the pieces of the story that don't make sense to me and put them in front of other people and see how they come together. And so I'm like, as soon as the machines start doing that, it's game over. Like they're basically humans at that
well,
point.
and you probably like the fact that I started learning dead languages before I started doing AI, right? Because it has an interesting story. It has an interesting. It's something unique, and there's a story I can tell, right? And imagine a machine now, even now, the large language models, they know a lot about dead languages. I mean, they're very good at, but they also at the same time, the same agent knows so much about chemistry and so much about, I don't know, geology. Is that still an interesting, um, guest to have? Like, would you have a guest that knows everything and is perfect in every sense? I think these kind of imperfections and unique paths that we have in our life stories, I think that's what we're gonna put a lot of value on, as opposed to some sort of completely perfect, all knowledgeable, but
It's hard to relate to something like that, I suppose.
dull
at the end of the day.
machine.
Like perfection is not relatable, really.
No, and I think that there's a cultural element to evolution. Like I think that, and you can place that somewhere that's well after, the bacteria deciding it wants to do something one way or another way. But I think that there is a decision that happens, and this is kind of, I think that Dennis Noble is arguing this. I think that Michael Levin is kind of arguing this in different ways, which is to say that we make choices about what we like and we don't like, and that shapes the future. And I think that it's not necessary, and you can say that if you look at a future with LLMs and they're better at us than at computation, that we're being forced out of the niche, and so we have to become different. But it's also possible that the burden of computation is actually something that we have been trying to offload from the very first time that we solved the first problem. And we've literally just been, because I look at the way that people are obsessed with building these things, and I can rationalize it in no other way, because I know people that are working on them, and they just love to solve puzzles.
Right.
They're just like, well, this is a crazy puzzle. Like, it's going to be an incredible puzzle to solve, and we'll solve it. And I'm like, why are you solving it? And they're like, it's a puzzle. And I'm like, why this
Well,
puzzle?
Or maybe I think as somebody who really enjoys solving puzzles, it'll be a very sad life if there were no puzzles left to solve. But I think there will be puzzles left to solve. It's like for some answers, I will have a machine that will give me an answer. There will be a golden period, I think, when machines become a really good tool, and that you can ask, a question, it helps you answer first set of questions, and then you go higher up, and then you find something new. The problem will become if they're ever able to, do their own curiosity, ask their own questions, and answer them in a creative new way. I don't think that is that. I don't think that that's we have an answer that says yes to that question. I think that's still, the jury is still out. Are they able to do it on their own? New theories. Because so far, I've been using AI as a tool. We call it AI interpretability. So understand how these models work that help you find new patterns in data that you wouldn't as a human, right? Because you're biased by your biology. But it's a tool right now. It's not making any of its own, questions. It's not creating new theoretical frameworks. And there's no Heidegger 2.0, right?
And there's
Or
not even any
no.
glimmer of it. That's what's
Right.
that's what's
No,
really
I agree. But there are some people think there are traces that's possible. But at any rate, I think there's going to be a golden period where some of for some of the difficult questions will be answers, and we'll be able to get to the better questions. The bigger question is, can machines get their own agency and start asking their own questions. And I don't think we're there yet, but I don't think also it's impossible. I actually don't think it's impossible. And there's a lot of smart people who don't think it. Jeffrey Hinton, for example, I think would say, I just don't have evidence that that's a complete ruled out possibility. And, even to say that is mind blowing, because I would not say that 4 years ago. I would definitely not say, what I think we're right before, as Benjamin Bratton says, paradigmatic shift. And it's, in a sense, it's a lucky time to be a scientist in that period of time.
Who's this person that you've mentioned a few times? Benjamin
Bratton. He is a philosopher at the UCSD, and a really interesting has a really interesting work on AI in the future and of life and the world.
Very cool.
Yeah, I think this is going to affect a lot of sciences. Actually, I think we're on the edge of a number of paradigm snaps, and the next decade or so is going to be potentially really exciting.
It's gonna be a wild ride, whatever happens.
But listen, man, we've kept you for almost 3 hours. This has kind of flown by, and I'd really love to talk to you again once you get this paper out, and we can dig deeper into the specifics of what the animals are actually doing.
Yeah, no, it was amazing. I loved this kind of formats because as a scientist, I'm always self-censoring from peer review. When I write a paper, I don't want to say stuff because I know that some peer reviewer will be mad and I won't be able to publish this paper. And in podcasts, you can kind of, you can express things that are brewing inside you, and you're less self-censored because nobody will hopefully peer review this.
Somebody in the comments section will be mad still, but someone will be ecstatic, someone will be mad.
But they won't prevent it. They won't prevent it from it being published. So
no, they will not.
No,
they do not have final say on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, I guess we'll let you go and
Thanks
check
so
back in with you in a couple of months. And thank you so much for giving us your time and thoughts. This is a lot for us to chew over.
Before you go, how do you pronounce your last name?
Beguš.
Beguš.
Yes.
Okay.
Very good. Thanks so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed the conversation. So happy to repeat the occasion.
Excellent.
Yeah, let's do it again soon.
Yeah. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
See ya. Bye, everybody.